Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was home alone that night. It had been raining for hours, that kind of rain that just doesn't stop, and everything was quiet except for the sound of it hitting the windows. I'd spent most of the evening watching TV, trying to wind down after a long day. My husband was out of town for work, so it was just me in the house. Around midnight, I was getting ready to head to bed. I had just turned off the TV when the doorbell rang. It startled me because it was so late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I paused for a moment, unsure of what to do. The doorbell rang again, and I decided to check. I grabbed my phone and walked cautiously to the front door. There was no people, just a window next to the door. I peeked out, but there was no one there. The porch light was on, illuminating the empty steps. I waited a few seconds, listening for any sounds, but all I could hear was the rain. I thought maybe it was kids playing a prank or something. I didn't want to think too much about it, so I turned off the porch light and headed back to the living room. As I walked back, I heard a faint sound coming from the backyard. It was hard to tell what it was with the rain, but it didn't seem right. My heart started pounding as I moved toward the kitchen, which had a big window overlooking the backyard. I hesitated before turning on the light, hoping I was just imagining things. When the light flickered on, I froze. There was someone standing near the back fence, just barely visible through the rain. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a figure. They weren't moving, just standing there, almost like they were waiting for something. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who it could be. I didn't have any neighbors who would be out at this hour, especially not in this weather. I quickly turned off the light and backed away from the window, hoping they hadn't seen me. My first thought was to call the police, but then I second-guessed myself. What if it was just someone passing by? Maybe they got lost or were taking a shortcut. But the way they were standing there, so still, made me uneasy. I grabbed my phone again and dialed my husband's number. He didn't pick up, probably asleep already. I sent him a quick text, letting him know what was going on, just in case. Then I went to the hallway and double-checked that all the doors were locked. They were, but I didn't feel any safer. I stood in the dark, listening to the rain, trying to calm myself down. I hoped that whoever it was would just leave. But a few minutes later, I heard another sound, this time closer. It was coming from the side of the house, near the garage. I slowly moved to the window in the living room that faced that side. I peeked out, barely breathing, and saw the figure again. They had moved from the backyard and were now standing just outside the garage door. I could see them more clearly now, a man in a dark jacket, hood pulled up, his face shadowed. He was facing the house, almost like he was trying to decide what to do next. Panic set in. I knew I couldn't stay in the house with him right outside. My mind was racing, trying to think of my options. I didn't have a weapon, nothing I could use to defend myself. The nearest police station was miles away, and with the rain, I wasn't sure how quickly they could get here. I considered running out the front door and making a break for it, but what if he saw me? What if there was more than one person? I felt trapped, my heart pounding in my chest so loudly that it drowned out the sound of the rain. I needed to get out, but I had to be smart about it. I decided to go upstairs, hoping I could get a better view of what he was doing from one of the bedroom windows. As quietly as I could, I made my way up the stairs, every creak of the floorboards making me wince. When I got to the bedroom, I crouched low and peeked out the window. The man was still there, but now he was moving, slowly walking along the side of the house, heading toward the backyard again. He was close enough now that I could see his face a bit more. He wasn't someone I recognized, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved, like he was in no rush, like he knew I was watching and wanted to scare me. I pulled back from the window, my mind made up. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my phone and keys and headed back downstairs, keeping an eye on where he was. He was near the back door now, looking at it like he was considering trying to get inside. I knew I had to act fast. I quietly unlocked the front door and slipped outside, the rain immediately soaking me to the bone. I didn't look back as I ran to my car, praying that the keys wouldn't slip from my wet hands. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the keys. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was standing in the middle of the street, watching me leave. His face was still shadowed, but I could tell he was smiling. That smile sent a chill down my spine that I'll never forget. I didn't stop driving until I was far from the house, somewhere I felt safe enough to pull over and call the police. They took my report and said they'd send someone to check the area, but I don't know if they ever found him. I didn't go back to the house that night. I couldn't. Even now, I can't stop thinking about how he was standing there, watching me. Like he knew I was scared, like he enjoyed it. I'm just glad I got out when I did. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't. I was driving home that night after a long shift at work. It had been raining for hours, the kind of steady rain that makes the road shine and everything look darker than it is. My eyes were heavy, and I was just trying to stay focused on the road, counting the minutes until I could crawl into bed. The drive was a quiet one, hardly any other cars out. Just the sound of the rain against the windshield and the occasional swipe of the wipers. I didn't live too far from work, maybe 20 minutes on a good day, but that night felt longer. Every minute dragged on as I drove down the empty road, trees on either side swaying in the wind. I must have zoned out for a bit because when I looked at the clock, more time had passed than I thought. I hadn't seen any cars for a while, just the rain and the dark. I remember thinking it was weird how empty the road was, but I figured everyone was already home, avoiding the storm. I was nearing a sharp bend in the road when I instinctively checked my rearview mirror. It was just a quick glance, something I did without thinking. But what I saw made my heart stop. There, in the back seat, was a figure. Someone was sitting in the back of my car. I almost lost control of the wheel, jerking the car to the side as my heart pounded in my chest. I forced myself to look back at the mirror, hoping I had just imagined it. But the figure was still there, sitting motionless, staring straight ahead. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't picked anyone up, and I was sure I had locked the doors when I got in the car. There was no way someone could have gotten in without me noticing. But there they were, sitting in the back seat like they belonged there. I didn't dare turn around to look directly. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I kept my eyes on the mirror, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there as if waiting for something. I thought about pulling over, but the road was so dark, and the rain was coming down harder. The idea of stopping in the middle of nowhere with a stranger in my car terrified me. I couldn't see their face clearly, just a vague outline, but that was enough to send chills down my spine. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was just tired, that maybe I was seeing things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone was there, and I had no idea what they wanted. As I drove, I started to notice little things. The air in the car felt colder, like a chill that seeped into my bones. My hands were shaking, making it harder to keep the car steady. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, so loud I was sure the figure could hear it. I kept glancing at the mirror, hoping the figure would disappear, but they stayed there, unmoving. I was too scared to speak, too scared to even think about what might happen next. All I could do was keep driving, praying I'd make it home safely. The road felt endless, each mile stretching on forever. My mind was racing, thinking of every possible scenario. Who were they? What did they want? Why were they in my car? I had no answers, just a growing sense of dread that made my skin crawl. I finally reached the turnoff for my neighborhood, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got home, but I knew I couldn't stay in the car any longer. I had to get out, no matter what. As I pulled onto my street, the rain let up a little, giving me a clearer view of the road ahead. My house was just a few blocks away, but it felt like miles. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting the figure to move, to do something. But they just sat there, as if they were waiting for the right moment. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I hesitated. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. I didn't want to look in the mirror again, didn't want to see that figure still sitting there. But I had to know if they were still there. Slowly, I forced myself to glance at the mirror one last time. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the back seat empty. The figure was gone, just like that, as if they had never been there. But I knew what I saw, and I knew they had been there. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't want to get out, didn't want to open the door and step into the night, but I knew I couldn't stay in the car forever. I finally worked up the courage to open the door and step out. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the night was quiet, too quiet. I hurried to my front door, fumbling with the keys as I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure somewhere in the shadows. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My mind was still racing, still trying to process what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the figure was still out there somewhere. I checked every room in the house, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. I even looked in the closets, under the bed, anywhere someone could hide. But the house was empty, just like the back seat had been. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump, every shadow seemed like it was moving. I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my head, couldn't stop wondering who they were and what they wanted. Even now, I still don't have answers. I never saw the figure again, but I still think about them, especially when I'm driving alone at night. The memory of that rainy night, of looking in the rearview mirror and seeing someone who shouldn't have been there, still haunts me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget it, or if I'll ever feel safe driving alone at night again. It was raining hard that night, the kind of rain that makes you hurry along just to get out of it. I had just come back from a night out with friends, feeling a little buzzed, but mostly just tired. The streets were quiet as I made my way back to my apartment complex in New York, the rain drumming on my umbrella. I was more focused on not getting drenched than on where I was going. When I finally reached the building, I was so relieved to be out of the rain that I didn't think twice about anything else. My hands were cold and wet as I fumbled for my keys. The hallway was dimly lit, and I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. I just wanted to get inside, get dry, and crash into bed. I found my key, slid it into the lock, and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, and I quickly kicked off my shoes, leaving them by the door. I was about to head straight to my bedroom when something felt off. I paused for a second, trying to figure out what it was. It smelled different. Not bad, just different, like someone had been cooking something with a lot of garlic or onions. I took a few steps inside, still not fully registering what was wrong. The layout seemed right, but it wasn't until I turned on a light that I noticed things weren't as they should be. The furniture was wrong, the pictures on the walls weren't mine, and there was a coat hanging on the rack that I had never seen before. That's when it hit me. I wasn't in my apartment. My heart started racing as I realized I must have entered the wrong unit. I turned around, ready to leave as quickly as I came in, but before I could make a move, I heard a noise from down the hallway. It was a low, muffled sound, like someone was talking, but I couldn't make out the words. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I panicked, looking for an escape route, but the door seemed too far away now. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I saw it. On the coffee table, there were photos laid out in a neat row, all of them showing different people, all of them tied up and gagged, their eyes wide with fear. My stomach turned, and I had to fight the urge to scream. I needed to get out of there, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The voices from the other room got louder, and I realized there was more than one person. I had no idea what they were saying, but the tone was low and serious, like they were planning something. I didn't want to stick around to find out what. I backed away slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible, but every creak of the floorboard felt like it echoed through the entire building. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how I had made such a stupid mistake. I just needed to get to the door, to get out of there and run, but I couldn't stop staring at those photos. The fear on those faces looked so real, so desperate. I finally snapped out of it and turned towards the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the knob, trying not to make any noise. I could hear footsteps now, getting closer, and the voices had stopped. Whoever was in the other room was coming, and I knew I didn't have much time. Just as I was about to pull the door open, the light in the hallway flicked on. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. A tall figure stepped into view, blocking my exit. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see a mix of surprise and something darker. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a look that made my blood run cold. I was trapped, and I knew it. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some excuse, some way to explain why I was in his apartment, but I couldn't find the words. The silence was deafening, and I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as he reached for me. I stumbled, crashing into a side table and knocking over a lamp. The noise was loud, too loud, and I knew the others in the apartment would hear it. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I didn't look back, didn't stop to see if he was coming after me. I just ran. I threw open the door and sprinted down the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear footsteps behind me, fast and heavy, but I didn't dare turn around. I burst through the stairwell door and practically flew down the steps. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could still hear him behind me, but I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, out into the rain-soaked streets. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but I kept running, not sure where I was going, just knowing I needed to get away. It wasn't until I was several blocks away that I finally dared to stop. I ducked into a dark alley, pressing myself against the wall as I tried to catch my breath. I waited there, listening for any sign of pursuit, but the only sound was the rain and my own ragged breathing. My mind was still reeling, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know who those people were or what they were planning, but I knew I had narrowly escaped something terrible. When I finally made it back to my own apartment, I locked the door behind me and sank to the floor, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid that if I closed my eyes, I'd wake up back in that wrong apartment, with those photos and those voices and that man with the dark eyes. It's been weeks now, and I still can't shake the memory of that night. Every time I come home, I double-check the door, making sure it's the right one. I haven't told anyone what happened. I don't even know how to explain it. The rain was coming down hard, the kind that made you want to stay inside, but I was out of food, and the store was open 24 hours. I figured it would be quick get in, get out. The store was nearly empty, just a few people wandering around with their carts, the fluorescent lights flickering a bit. I grabbed a cart and started down the produce aisle. It was quiet, just the hum of the coolers and the sound of the rain against the windows. I was picking out some apples when I noticed him. A man, maybe in his 40s, standing at the end of the aisle. He wasn't looking at the produce or anything, just standing there, staring right at me. It felt off, but I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe he was just lost in thought. I moved on to the next aisle, grabbing some bread and cereal. When I looked up, he was there again, standing at the end of the aisle, watching me. This time, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was the way he was staring, like he was studying me or something. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. It was late, and the store was almost empty. Maybe he was just another night owl like me, wandering around. But as I kept shopping, it became clear he was following me. Every aisle I went down, he was there, always at the end, always watching. I started to feel uneasy, my heart beating faster. I told myself to just ignore him, that he would go away, but he didn't. He just kept following, aisle after aisle. When I got to the dairy section, I pretended to be interested in the milk, hoping he would lose interest and go away. But when I glanced up, he was closer, halfway down the aisle, just standing there with his eyes fixed on me. It was like he wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. My hands were shaking a little as I grabbed the milk and tossed it into my cart. I decided I had enough and headed towards the checkout, hoping that would put some distance between us. But when I turned the corner, I saw him again, this time even closer. He wasn't pushing a cart or holding any groceries. He was just there, staring at me with this blank, intense look. I couldn't figure out what he wanted, but it was clear he was following me. I hurried to the self-checkout, scanning my items as fast as I could. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to make a scene, but I couldn't just let him keep following me. I glanced around, hoping to see a security guard or something, but the store was almost empty. Just me, the man, and a couple of other late-night shoppers who seemed oblivious. As I finished scanning my items, I felt a presence behind me. I turned my head slightly and saw him standing just a few feet away, closer than he had been all night. I could feel his eyes on me, burning into the back of my neck. I swiped my card and grabbed my bags, my hands shaking as I stuffed a receipt into my pocket. I didn't look back, just headed straight for the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain was still pouring down as I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I hurried to my car, fumbling with my keys, trying not to look around. But I could feel him. I knew he was there, following me. My car was parked near the edge of the lot, and it felt like it was a mile away. I finally reached my car and yanked open the door, throwing my bags into the passenger seat. As I was about to get in, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned around, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, his face partially hidden by the hood of his jacket, the rain dripping off it. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me with that same intense look. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, we just stood there, the rain pouring down around us. I didn't know what he wanted or what he was going to do, but I knew I had to get out of there. I jumped into my car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were trembling as I jammed the key into the ignition. I started the car and backed out as fast as I could, my tires screeching on the wet pavement. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and he was still there, standing in the rain, watching me drive away. His face was almost expressionless, but his eyes were full of something I couldn't quite place, something that scared me to my core. I drove out of the parking lot, my heart still pounding, glancing in the mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see his face again. But the road was empty, just me in the rain. I didn't stop until I got home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I just sat there for a minute, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked around, making sure I wasn't followed, but everything seemed quiet, normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there somewhere, still watching me. I grabbed my bags and hurried inside, locking the door behind me and checking all the windows. My heart was still racing, my mind replaying the night over and over. I couldn't figure out why he had followed me or what he wanted, but I knew I never wanted to see him again. I didn't sleep much that night, every little noise making me jump. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see him standing outside, just watching. But the street was empty, just the rain tapping against the glass. I went for a jog, like I always do. The rain was coming down pretty hard, but I didn't mind. It was a quiet, steady kind of rain that I find relaxing. The park near my house is usually empty this late, so it's a good time to clear my head. I had my headphones in, listening to some music, just focusing on my breathing and the sound of my feet hitting the pavement. After a few minutes, I noticed something that made me uneasy. There was someone else in the park, a man, jogging too. At first, I didn't think much of it. People jog at night, especially in a neighborhood like mine. But as I kept going, I realized he was keeping pace with me. Not right behind me, but close enough that I could see him every time I glanced over my shoulder. I picked up the pace a little, hoping to create some distance between us, but he did the same. He wasn't running faster to pass me or anything, just matching my speed. It was strange, and I started to feel a bit anxious. The park was dark, with just a few streetlights scattered around, casting long shadows across the path. The rain made everything seem quieter, more isolated. I decided to change my route, veering off the main path and taking a turn that led through a more wooded area. It was a bit darker, but it was a shortcut that would bring me back to my starting point quicker. As I made the turn, I glanced back, hoping he would continue on the main path. But he didn't. He turned with me, still keeping his distance but not letting me out of his sight. My heart started beating faster, and it wasn't just from the jogging. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breathing getting shallow. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that he was just another jogger out for a run, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sped up again, this time pushing myself hard, trying to get away from him. The path was slick from the rain, and I could hear the sound of my feet splashing in the puddles, but so could he. Every time I sped up, he did too, keeping that same distance between us. It was like a game to him, staying just far enough back that I couldn't really confront him, but close enough that I knew he was there. The path twisted and turned, leading through the trees, and I started to feel a bit disoriented. Everything looked different in the dark, the rain making it harder to see. I was losing my sense of direction, not sure if I was getting closer to the exit or deeper into the park. All the while, I could hear him behind me, his footsteps splashing in time with mine. Panic was setting in now. I could feel it in my chest, in the way my legs were starting to burn. I wasn't just jogging anymore. I was running, really running, trying to get away. I didn't dare look back again. I didn't want to see how close he was getting. I made another sharp turn, hoping it would throw him off, but I could still hear him, closer now. I started thinking about all the stories you hear, the warnings about jogging alone at night, especially in the rain, especially in a place as secluded as this. I regretted every decision that led me here, but it was too late for that. The path ahead was starting to slope upward, leading to a small hill that overlooked the park. I knew if I could make it to the top, I'd be closer to the street, closer to safety. But my legs were tired, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and I wasn't sure I could keep up the pace much longer. I pushed myself, every muscle screaming, every instinct telling me to keep going. The sound of his footsteps was louder now, closer, almost in sync with mine. He was gaining on me, and I knew I couldn't outrun him forever. I just needed to make it to the top, to the streetlights, to where someone might see us. When I finally reached the top of the hill, I was drenched in sweat, my lungs burning. I stopped for just a second, just to catch my breath, to see where he was. I turned around, expecting him to be right behind me, but he wasn't there. The path was empty, the trees swaying in the wind, the rain still falling in sheets. He was gone. I didn't know what to think. My heart was still pounding, my body tense, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps, no shadow, nothing. Just me, standing alone in the rain, the park stretching out below me, dark and empty. I wanted to believe it was over, that he had just given up and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me from somewhere in the dark. I turned back towards the street, my legs shaking as I started to jog again, this time slower, more cautious. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting him to appear out of nowhere, but he didn't. The streetlights were just ahead, the rain washing over me, and I could see the outline of houses in the distance. I was almost there, almost safe, but I couldn't relax, not yet. When I finally made it to the street, I slowed to a walk, my breath still coming in short gasps. I looked around, half expecting to see him standing under one of the streetlights, but the street was empty. I kept walking, not daring to stop until I was home, the rain soaking through my clothes, my heart still racing. It wasn't until I was inside, the door locked behind me, that I finally let myself breathe. I stood there in the hallway, dripping wet, my hands trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. I couldn't explain it, couldn't make sense of it, but I knew I'd never forget the feeling of being followed, the sound of his footsteps matching mine, the way he just disappeared. I haven't gone jogging since. It was a rainy night, and I was sitting in my apartment in Texas, just trying to unwind after a long day at work. The rain was coming down hard, pounding against the windows. I always found it kind of relaxing, like white noise that drowned out everything else. I had just finished dinner and was about to settle in with a movie when there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not this late. It was well past 10, and I don't really know anyone in the building. I live alone, so I wasn't sure what to expect. I got up and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anyone. There was just a dark shape on the floor outside my door. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the door and saw a package sitting there. It was a plain brown box, kind of wet from the rain, but not soaked through. There was no address, no name, nothing to indicate where it came from. Just a box, left right in front of my door. I brought it inside, my hands a little shaky, but I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe it was delivered to the wrong apartment. But as soon as I set it down on the table, I felt this weird sense of unease. The box was heavier than I expected, and when I shook it gently, something inside shifted, making a soft, muffled sound. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and cut the tape sealing the box. I was half expecting it to be empty or filled with packing material, but when I opened it, I froze. Inside the box were a bunch of random items, but none of them made any sense. There was a small teddy bear, a set of keys, a worn-out notebook, and a watch that had stopped at 3:17. All of it was just thrown in there like someone didn't care. At the bottom of the box, there was a folded piece of paper. My heart started to race as I picked it up. I could feel the paper was damp, maybe from the rain, or maybe from something else. I unfolded it slowly, my fingers trembling. The note was handwritten in messy, almost frantic letters that seemed to slant off the page. It read, "We're watching." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I looked around my apartment, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But of course, I was alone. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, almost drowning out my thoughts. I couldn't figure out what any of this meant. The items in the box were all things I'd never seen before, things that had no connection to me. The teddy bear looked old, like it had been someone's childhood toy. The notebook was filled with pages of scribbles and notes I couldn't make sense of. The keys didn't fit anything in my apartment, and the watch, that stopwatch, just gave me a bad feeling, like it was marking the time something terrible had happened. I sat there for a while, just staring at the box and its contents, trying to make sense of it all. My mind was racing, thinking about who could have sent it and why. Was it a joke? Some kind of prank? But the note didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a threat, like someone was out there watching me right now. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That I got a weird package with some random stuff in it and a creepy note? They'd probably just brush it off as nothing, tell me not to worry about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I decided to get rid of the box. I didn't want it in my apartment any longer. I grabbed a trash bag, threw everything inside, and tied it up tight. I planned to take it out to the dumpster in the back of the building, but the thought of going outside in the dark, in the rain, with that note in my mind, I couldn't do it. Not right then. So I left the bag by the door, planning to take it out first thing in the morning. I tried to distract myself, put on the movie I had been planning to watch, but I couldn't focus. Every little noise outside made me jump. The sound of the rain, the creak of the building, everything seemed amplified. I kept looking at the clock, watching the minutes tick by, but I couldn't stop thinking about the box and the note. We're watching. The words were stuck in my head, echoing over and over. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, that someone was messing with me, but it didn't help. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would help me clear my mind. I double-checked all the locks on my door, even pushed a chair up against it, just in case. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain. My mind was still racing, still trying to figure out who could have sent the package and why. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that note, those words, and it made my heart pound. Sometime in the middle of the night, I must have drifted off, but it wasn't restful sleep. I had nightmares, strange, unsettling dreams where I was being followed, watched by shadowy figures I couldn't see. I woke up several times, my heart racing, but the apartment was quiet, the only sound the rain still tapping against the windows. When morning finally came, I got up, feeling exhausted, like I hadn't slept at all. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside gray and damp. I grabbed the trash bag with the box and its contents and took it outside to the dumpster. I wanted it gone, out of my life. As I walked back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Like I was being watched. I looked around, but the street was empty, just a few cars parked along the curb, no one in sight. I went back inside, but the unease didn't leave me. I couldn't stop thinking about the package, the things inside, and especially the note. It felt like a warning, like someone was trying to scare me, or worse, like they were planning something. I tried to go about my day, but everything felt off. Every time I heard a noise, I jumped. Every time I saw someone on the street, I wondered if they were the ones who sent the package. I couldn't focus on anything. The whole day passed in a blur, my mind stuck on that note. That night, I locked up my apartment again, but I didn't feel safe. I kept thinking about the note, the way the words seemed to twist and slant off the page, the way it felt damp and cold in my hands. I didn't want to be alone, but I didn't know who I could talk to about it. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The rain had started up again, soft at first, then growing heavier, drumming against the windows. I lay there, staring into the darkness, listening to the rain and the creaks of the building. I felt like someone was out there, just beyond the walls, watching and waiting. At some point in the night, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. It was soft, barely audible over the rain, but it was there. A scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining to listen. The noise stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it again, closer this time, coming from right outside my door. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't think, just sat there, listening, terrified. The noise stopped, and there was silence again, but it didn't feel right. It felt like someone was standing just outside my door, waiting for me to make a move. I didn't dare get up, didn't dare check the door. I just sat there, my heart racing, my body frozen in fear. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the noise didn't start up again. The rain kept falling, the sound of it filling the apartment, but nothing else. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, just sat there, waiting for something to happen, but it didn't. When morning came, I finally got up, my body stiff and sore from sitting in the same position for hours. I checked the door, but there was nothing there, no sign of anything out of place. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, like the calm before a storm. I still don't know who sent the package or what they wanted, but I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. It was one of those nights where the rain wouldn't let up, just pouring down hard against the roof and windows, making the whole house feel damp. I couldn't sleep, so I was just lying there in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm. The clock on my nightstand showed it was just past 3 a.m. I was half awake, not really thinking about anything when I heard it. A loud, frantic knocking at the front door. My heart jumped into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and who in their right mind would be out in this weather at this hour? I sat up, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a branch hitting the door. But then it came again, louder and more desperate this time. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out of bed and grabbed my phone, just in case. I didn't turn on any lights, not wanting to let whoever was out there know I was awake. I crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. When I got to the door, I hesitated again, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Instead of opening it, I leaned in to look through the peephole. The rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to see anything clearly. But there was no one there. The porch was empty. My heart was still pounding, and I could feel the tension in my chest, but I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the sound had come from somewhere else, like a neighbor's house, and I had just imagined it was at my door. But just as I was about to turn away, the knocking started again, this time at the back door. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and insistent. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no way someone could have moved that fast from the front to the back without me hearing their footsteps, right? I didn't want to check, but I knew I had to. I slowly made my way through the kitchen toward the back door. I kept to the shadows, moving as quietly as I could. The rain was still pounding against the windows, and it made it hard to hear anything else. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob. Before I looked out the window and the door, I froze. Something wasn't right. The knocking had stopped, but I could feel something, like someone was there, just on the other side of the door, waiting. I stood there, trying to gather the courage to look out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Suddenly, the knocking started again, even louder this time, like someone was pounding on the door with both fists. I jumped back, my heart racing. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in on me. My first thought was to call the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was knocking on my doors in the middle of the night and then disappearing? I backed away from the door, not wanting to be anywhere near it. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I open the door? Should I stay quiet and hope they go away? I didn't know. I just knew I didn't want to be standing there in the dark with that knocking echoing in my ears. I decided to head back to the living room, where I could keep an eye on both doors from a distance. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and held it tight in my hand, ready to use it if I had to. I stood there, waiting, listening, every muscle in my body tense. The knocking stopped again, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything out of the ordinary, but all I could hear was my own breathing, heavy and uneven. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone staring back at me from the darkness, but there was nothing. Then, without warning, the knocking started again, but this time it was coming from the side of the house. It was as if someone was going around, trying every door, every window, trying to find a way in. I couldn't breathe, my mind racing with fear. I felt trapped, not knowing where they would try next, or what they wanted. I backed up against the wall, holding the lamp like a weapon, trying to stay calm, trying to think of what to do. But all I could think about was the sound of that knocking, moving around the house, getting closer and closer. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, and I was the prey. The knocking moved again, this time to a window in the living room. I nearly dropped the lamp, my hands were shaking so badly. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just stood there, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But after a few minutes, the knocking stopped completely. The silence was almost worse. My ears were ringing from the tension, and I could barely hear over the pounding of my own heart. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the next knock, but it never came. Finally, I mustered up the courage to move. I crept toward the window, keeping low, and peeked out from the corner. The rain was still coming down hard, making it difficult to see, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, the street beyond it deserted. I wanted to believe it was over, that whoever it was had finally left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching. I stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, too scared to let my guard down. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept expecting the knocking to start again. But it didn't. The rain eventually let up, and the sky started to lighten, but I still couldn't relax. When morning finally came, I checked every door and window, but there was no sign of anyone. No muddy footprints, no damage, nothing to show that someone had been there at all. But I knew what I had heard. I knew it wasn't my imagination. I spent the day trying to go about my routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Every time I heard a noise outside, I froze, half expecting to hear that knocking again. I felt like I was being watched, like whoever had been there last night hadn't gone far. As night fell again, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights or go to bed. I stayed in the living room, the lamp still in my hand, waiting. I don't know what I was waiting for, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. Not until I knew for sure it was over. But deep down, I wasn't sure it would ever be over. That knocking, that feeling of being watched, it was burned into my mind. I didn't know who it was, or why they had chosen my house, but I knew I would never forget that night. And I knew I would never feel safe in my own home again. I was driving through Arizona late at night, and the rain was coming down hard, making it difficult to see the road. I'd been on the road for hours, and my eyes were burning from the strain. I just wanted to find a place to rest, somewhere cheap where I could crash for the night. That's when I saw the sign for the motel. It wasn't much to look at, a flickering neon sign and a few rundown rooms lined up in a row, but it was better than nothing. I pulled in, the tires splashing water as I parked. The place looked deserted, not a single car in the lot besides mine. The office was dimly lit, and when I went inside, an old man was sitting behind the desk, watching an ancient TV set with terrible reception. He barely looked at me when I asked for a room, just handed me a key and mumbled something about checkout being at 10 a.m. I took the key, walked back out into the rain, and found my room. Number 7, right in the middle of the row. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the room inside wasn't any more inviting than the outside. The bedspread was old and worn, the carpet stained, and the whole place smelled like mildew. But I was too tired to care. I dropped my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. It was then, as I was lying there, staring at the water-stained ceiling, that I heard it. A faint noise, coming from the room next door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the rain hitting the side of the building, but then I heard it again. A low, muffled sound, like someone was talking, or maybe arguing. The walls were thin, and I could just make out the tone, but not the words. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was none of my business, but the more I listened, the more I could hear. It wasn't just one person. There were multiple voices, all talking at once, too low for me to understand what they were saying. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The noise went on for a few minutes, then stopped abruptly. The sudden silence made the room feel even more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up, went to the window, and peeked out through the curtains. The rain was still coming down hard, but through the sheets of water, I could see shadows moving outside. They were just shapes, barely visible in the darkness, but there was definitely more than one person out there. They were moving past my door, slowly, like they were trying to be quiet. My breath caught in my throat as I watched them. What were they doing out there in the rain, in the middle of the night? I backed away from the window, my pulse quickening. Something was off about this whole situation. The voices, the shadows, it was like they were waiting for something, or someone. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, which wasn't surprising in a place like this. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. Then, I heard it again, the voices, only this time they were louder, closer. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out what they were saying. It was still too muffled, but I could tell they were agitated, maybe even angry. I glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. A soft knock on the door made me jump. I stood frozen, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It was just a single knock, not like someone who wanted to get my attention, more like a signal. I backed away from the door, not daring to make a sound. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Should I stay quiet? My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on, but I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I didn't want to open that door. The shadows outside, the voices next door, Everything about this place was wrong. I decided to stay put, hoping whoever was out there would go away if I didn't answer. But the knocking continued, slow and steady, like they knew I was inside and weren't going to leave until I opened the door. I backed up until I was against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, the voices next door started up again, louder and more urgent. It sounded like they were arguing, and I could hear things being knocked over, like there was a struggle. I was terrified. What if they came through the wall? What if the people outside decided to break down the door? Suddenly, everything went quiet. The knocking stopped, the voices stopped. All I could hear was the rain and my own ragged breathing. I didn't move, didn't even dare to breathe, waiting for something to happen. A few minutes passed, and still nothing. I crept back to the window, just enough to peek out. The shadows were gone. The lot was empty, just my car sitting there in the rain. I let out a shaky breath, but the fear didn't go away. If anything, the silence made it worse. I went back to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the lock. I was ready to bolt out of there, to get back in my car and drive as far away from this place as I could. But something stopped me. I don't know if it was fear or instinct, but I hesitated. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sound on the other side. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Someone was right outside the door, just standing there, breathing heavily. My blood turned to ice. They hadn't left. They were waiting for me to open the door. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run. But I was trapped. If I opened the door, they would get in. If I stayed, I didn't know what they would do next. Then, the doorknob rattled. Slowly at first, then more forcefully, like someone was trying to open it. I watched in horror as it turned slightly, but the lock held. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag, threw on my shoes, and bolted for the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, holding my breath, waiting. The doorknob outside stopped turning, and everything went quiet again. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there in the darkness, praying they would go away. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. I was too scared to move, too scared to think. Finally, I heard footsteps, faint and fading, like someone walking away. I waited, still too scared to come out. Eventually, the fear of staying in that room outweighed the fear of what might be outside. I got up, crept to the door, and opened it just enough to peek out. The room was empty. I could see the front door from where I stood. It was still closed, the lock still in place. I made a run for it. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked. The rain was still coming down hard, but I didn't care. I started the engine and sped out of that lot. The rain was coming down hard that night, hammering against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists. It was late, probably close to midnight, and I was alone in the house. My husband was out of town for work, and the kids were staying over at their grandparents' for the weekend. The house was too quiet, except for the rain and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I was in the living room, half watching some old movie on TV, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept hearing these noises, faint and distant, like something moving around. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe the house settling, but the more I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't either of those things. It was coming from the basement. Our basement was unfinished and mostly used for storage. I didn't go down there much, only when I had to fetch something or put away some boxes. The thought of going down there now, in the middle of the night, made my skin crawl. But the noise kept going, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone or something was moving around. I tried to ignore it at first, turning up the volume on the TV and telling myself it was nothing. But the noise got louder, more persistent, until I couldn't pretend anymore. My heart started to pound as I stood up, trying to muster the courage to check it out. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the basement door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, each step feeling like it took a year off my life. The air down there was cold and damp, the kind that clings to your skin and makes you shiver. I could hear the noise more clearly now, and it was definitely coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. When I reached the bottom, I swung the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the darkness. The familiar sight of dusty boxes and old furniture greeted me, but nothing seemed out of place. The noise had stopped, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. But then, I heard it again, closer this time. It was coming from behind a stack of old boxes in the corner. I hesitated, my heart racing, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the boxes aside, revealing a wall I had never paid much attention to before. That's when I saw it, a door. It was small, almost like a crawlspace entrance, and it was set low on the wall, half hidden by the boxes that had been piled in front of it. I could swear it hadn't been there before. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle. The metal was cold and slick from the damp air. I hesitated, thinking maybe I should just turn around and go back upstairs, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something drew me to it, an urge I couldn't explain, like I had to know what was behind that door. I pulled it open, and the hinges let out a long, low creak that sent chills down my spine. The smell hit me first, musty, like old earth and rotting wood. I shined the flashlight into the darkness beyond, and that's when I heard it. Voices. They were faint, almost like a whisper, but they were definitely there. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unsettling, like a low murmur of conversation that wasn't meant to be heard. I froze, the beam of the flashlight trembling as I tried to focus on the source of the sound. The space beyond the door was narrow, like a tunnel, with rough walls that looked like they had been carved out of the earth. The voices seemed to be coming from somewhere further down, where the tunnel disappeared into darkness. I felt a surge of fear, a primal instinct telling me to slam the door shut and run back upstairs. But I didn't move. I couldn't. I don't know what possessed me to take that first step into the tunnel, but once I did, I couldn't stop. The walls closed in around me, the air growing colder and thicker with each step. The voices grew louder, more distinct, though still too low for me to understand. I kept going, the flashlight flickering as I walked deeper into the tunnel. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a point where the tunnel widened into a small, circular room. The walls were lined with shelves, old and rotting, and on those shelves were jars, dozens of them, filled with murky liquid and something floating inside that I couldn't make out. The sight of those jars made my stomach turn, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. That's when I noticed the source of the voices. In the center of the room was a large, old-fashioned radio, the kind you'd see in black and white movies. It was crackling with static, and from that static came the voices. They were clearer now, but still muffled, like they were speaking from a great distance. I inched closer, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The words were still indistinguishable, but the tone was cold, almost clinical, like someone giving instructions. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I kept moving closer, drawn to that voice like a moth to a flame. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into total darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to turn back on, but it was dead. The voices continued, growing louder, more urgent, and I realized they weren't coming from the radio anymore. They were all around me. I turned and ran, my hands outstretched to feel the walls of the tunnel as I stumbled back the way I had come. The voices followed me, growing louder, more frantic, like they were right behind me. My heart was in my throat, and every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there as fast as I could. I reached the door, almost tripping in my haste, and slammed it shut behind me. The voices stopped instantly, leaving me in a silence so deep it was deafening. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door as if I could somehow keep whatever was on the other side from getting out. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally gathered the courage to move. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. The basement was quiet again, just the sound of rain hitting the windows above. The door looked normal, just an old, dusty piece of wood, but I knew better now. I stumbled back up the stairs, barely able to catch my breath, and locked the basement door behind me. I don't know what I found down there, and I don't want to know. The house felt different after that night, like it was watching me, waiting for something. I never went back down to the basement, and I made sure the door stayed locked at all times. I was on the couch, half watching a movie I'd seen a dozen times before. My mind was somewhere else, thinking about work, about life, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was late, close to midnight, and I remember frowning at the screen. The call was from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer it. I usually don't, but something about that night made me pick up. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the quiet in the apartment. I don't know. I swiped to answer and brought the phone to my ear, waiting for a voice. There was a pause, just long enough to make me uncomfortable. Then, a voice, low and almost casual, came through the line. "I can see you," it said. I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice was calm, too calm, like it was used to saying things like that. I glanced around the room, feeling suddenly exposed even though I was alone. I didn't say anything at first, just listened to the rain and that steady breathing on the other end. "You're wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans," the voice continued, like it was reading from a script. My heart skipped a beat. I looked down at myself. Gray t-shirt, jeans. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't have any windows open, and my blinds were drawn. There was no way someone could see me. "Who is this?" I finally asked, my voice shaky, almost a whisper. I wanted to sound in control, but I knew I didn't. The voice ignored my question. "You're sitting on your couch, facing the TV," it said, and I could hear the faintest hint of a smile in those words. My blood went cold. I stood up quickly, moving to the window, pulling the blinds open just a crack to peer outside. There was nothing out there, just the rain-slicked street and the empty sidewalk. I let the blinds fall back into place, my heart hammering in my chest. I felt like a trapped animal, not sure where the danger was coming from, only that it was close. "Don't bother looking," the voice said, sounding amused now. "You won't find me." I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. The thought of someone watching me, knowing exactly what I was doing, made my skin crawl. I could feel my pulse in my ears, loud and fast. "What do you want?" I asked, louder this time, trying to regain some control, trying to sound like I wasn't terrified. The words came out more like a plea than a demand. There was a pause again, like the caller was considering the question. "I want you to listen," the voice said finally, slow and deliberate. "And I want you to do exactly what I say." I felt like the room was closing in on me. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to hang up, to call someone, to get out. But I was frozen, the phone pressed to my ear, my hand shaking. "Go to your bedroom," the voice instructed. "Now." I didn't move at first. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening, what I should do. But the voice on the phone was patient, waiting, knowing that eventually I would do what it said. I started walking towards the hallway, my legs feeling like lead. The floor creaked under my weight, and I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. The voice stayed silent as I moved, the only sound the rain outside and the pounding of my heart. When I reached the bedroom, I stopped in the doorway, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles were white. The room was dark, just the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the curtains. I didn't want to go in. I didn't want to know what the voice had planned for me. Turn on the light, the voice said, almost gently, like it was giving me a choice. But I knew it wasn't. I reached for the switch, my hand trembling. The light flickered on, flooding the room with a harsh, artificial brightness. Everything looked normal, exactly how I had left it. But that didn't make me feel any better. Now, look at the bed, the voice said, and I could hear that smile again, like it was enjoying this, like it knew something I didn't. I turned, slowly, my eyes locking onto the bed. There was nothing unusual about it, just the rumpled sheets and my pillow. But then, my gaze fell to the foot of the bed, and I froze. There, lying neatly on the floor, was a black hoodie. I knew that hoodie. It wasn't mine. That's for you, the voice said, the tone almost mocking now. Put it on. I stared at the hoodie, my mind racing, trying to figure out how it got there, what this person wanted from me. The thought of touching it, of putting it on, made my skin crawl. But I also knew that refusing wasn't an option. I bent down slowly, my fingers brushing the fabric. It was cold, damp, like it had been outside. I picked it up, the weight of it heavy in my hands. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Good, the voice said, and I could hear satisfaction in that word. Now, go back to the living room. I straightened up, the hoodie draped over my arm. My legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I was in danger. I could feel it, like a predator's eyes on the back of my neck. I walked back down the hallway, the apartment feeling too quiet, too still. The living room was just as I had left it, the TV still playing that movie I wasn't watching. But now, everything felt different, like I was walking into a trap. Put the hoodie on the couch, the voice instructed. Then sit down. I did as I was told, laying the hoodie on the couch like it was something fragile, something dangerous. Then I sat down, my body tense, ready to run if I needed to. The phone was still pressed to my ear, the voice waiting for me to comply. There was a long pause, the silence stretching out until it felt like it might snap. I could hear the rain outside, the soft hum of the TV, and my own breath, quick and shaky. I was trapped, caught in some twisted game, and I didn't know the rules. Then, finally, the voice spoke again, softer now, almost a whisper. You did well, it said. Now, go to the window. I didn't want to. Every part of me was screaming to stay where I was, to hang up the phone and call the police. But I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't matter. This person, whoever they were, was in control. I stood up slowly, my feet dragging as I moved to the window. The blinds were still drawn, the room bathed in that sickly yellow light from the street lamps outside. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before I pulled the blinds open just a crack. There was nothing there. Just the rain-soaked street, empty and silent. No movement, no sign of anyone watching me. I felt a small flicker of relief, like maybe this was all some sick joke, and it was over. But then, the voice came through the phone one last time, and I felt a cold chill wash over me again. Don't worry, it said, almost kind now. We'll be watching. The line went dead, leaving me standing there, staring out at the empty street, the phone still pressed to my ear. I felt like I had just woken up from a nightmare, but the fear was still there, heavy and suffocating. I dropped the phone, backing away from the window, my mind spinning. I didn't know who he was or what they wanted, but I knew they weren't done with me. And I knew, without a doubt, that I would never feel safe in my own home again. I was at this old, run-down bus stop in the middle of nowhere, waiting for the last bus. The shelter was barely holding together, and the wind kept blowing the rain right at me. I was soaked, cold, and just wanted to get home. The streetlights flickered above me, casting a dim, eerie light on the empty road. Everything around me felt off, like I shouldn't be there. I kept looking down the road, hoping to see the bus headlights cutting through the rain, but there was nothing. Just the steady sound of water hitting the pavement and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I checked my watch again, getting more anxious. It was getting late, and I hadn't seen another soul for at least half an hour. Then, out of the darkness, I saw a pair of headlights in the distance. They were moving slowly, too slowly, like the driver was looking for something or someone. The car passed by the bus stop, barely making any noise, and continued down the road. I thought nothing of it at first, just another car driving by. But then, after a few minutes, the headlights appeared again, coming back from the other direction. The car passed by me again, even slower this time. I couldn't see much through the rain and the dim light, but I could feel eyes on me as it went by. My heart started beating faster. The car disappeared around the corner, and I was left standing there, the rain pounding on the roof of the shelter, the air feeling heavier by the second. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, just someone lost or maybe waiting for someone. But a few minutes later, the car came back, creeping along the road like a predator. This time, it stopped right in front of the bus stop. The engine idled quietly, the headlights casting long shadows on the wet pavement. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, and I saw a man sitting inside. His face was half hidden in the darkness, but I could see enough to know he wasn't smiling. He looked at me for a moment, not saying anything. The silence hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. I tried not to look directly at him, but it was hard to ignore. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and calm, almost too calm. "Need a ride?" he asked. I shook my head, muttering something about waiting for the bus. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky. The man didn't seem to care. He just kept staring at me, like he was sizing me up. "You sure?" "It's not safe out here in the rain," he said, his voice still calm, but there was something in it that made my skin crawl. I told him again that I was fine, that the bus would be here soon. He didn't move. He just kept looking at me, his eyes never leaving mine. A few seconds passed, though it felt much longer, and then he nodded slowly, like he had made a decision. The window rolled up, and the car started to move forward, but only a few feet. Then it stopped again. My heart sank. I didn't know what to do. The rain was falling harder now, the noise almost deafening, and my mind was racing. I thought about making a run for it, but where would I go? The road was empty, and there were no houses or stores nearby, just darkness and rain. The car stayed where it was, the engine still running, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, the passenger door clicked open. The man didn't say anything this time. He didn't have to. The open door was invitation enough. I took a step back, my shoes splashing in the puddles beneath me. My throat was dry, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. He didn't try to coax me anymore, just waited, his face still mostly hidden in shadow. The open door seemed like a black hole, something I'd disappear into if I made the wrong move. I could hear the rain pounding on the roof of the car, the drops running down in steady streams. Everything felt unreal, like time had slowed down. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing with what I should do. The rain kept pouring down, soaking through my jacket, chilling me to the bone. I thought about my options, but none of them seemed good. Run? Wait for the bus? Get in? I looked down the road, hoping to see the bus's headlights, but there was nothing. Just the endless rain and the dim glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. I was alone, completely alone with this man and his open car door. I didn't want to get in. Every instinct told me not to. But what if the bus never came? What if this was my only way out of here? My thoughts kept spiraling, making it hard to think straight. I could feel my heart beating faster and faster, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. The man's patience seemed endless. He just waited, his face unreadable, his presence more menacing with each passing second. Finally, something snapped inside me. I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from him. The sound of my shoes slapping against the wet pavement echoed in the night, mixing with the relentless rain. I expected him to follow me, to drive after me, but he didn't. The car stayed where it was, and as I looked back over my shoulder, I saw the door slowly closing. The car's headlights flickered off, plunging the area into darkness, and then it was gone. I didn't stop running until I reached a main road, my breath ragged, my clothes soaked through. I found another bus stop, this one with people waiting, and I stayed close to them, never letting them out of my sight. The bus eventually came, and I got on, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. I kept thinking about the man, about what might have happened if I had gotten in that car. It was a Friday night, and the rain hadn't stopped for hours. The streets outside were empty, just the occasional car passing by, its tires splashing through puddles. I was sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen, trying to finish up the last of my work. Everyone else had left hours ago, but I needed to meet a deadline. The office was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the constant tapping of rain against the windows. I glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight. The rain was coming down harder now, the sound of it hitting the glass louder, almost drowning out everything else. I rubbed my eyes and stood up, stretching my legs. The office felt too big, too empty. All the lights were off except for the ones near my desk. I could see the reflection of the empty cubicles in the glass walls that surrounded the floor. As I walked over to the break room to get a cup of coffee, something caught my eye. A shadow near the glass doors at the entrance. I stopped, squinting to see through the dim light and rain. At first, I thought it was just the security guard making his rounds. They usually check the building at night, making sure everything was locked up. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't him. The figure was tall, standing perfectly still just outside the doors. I could barely make out any details through the rain-smeared glass, but I could tell they were facing the building, looking directly at me. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure why, but something about it didn't feel right. I froze, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just someone seeking shelter from the rain, or maybe they were lost and needed directions. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I moved closer to the door, my footsteps quiet on the carpet. The figure didn't move, just kept standing there, watching. When I was just a few feet away, I stopped. The rain had formed a thick sheet over the glass, distorting the view, but I could see enough. It wasn't the security guard. It was someone else. Their face was partially obscured by a hood, but I could see their eyes. They were locked onto mine, unblinking. I felt a chill run down my spine. My hand instinctively went to the door's handle, making sure it was locked. The figure didn't react, just kept staring. I backed away slowly, trying not to panic. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I returned to my desk, grabbing my phone. I thought about calling security, but then I remembered they usually left by midnight. I dialed the building's front desk anyway, but no one answered. The phone just rang and rang. I hung up and tried to think. Maybe it was nothing, just some weird coincidence. Maybe they would leave soon. But they didn't. I tried to ignore it, going back to my work, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing over at the glass doors, expecting to see the figure gone. But every time I looked, they were still there. Standing in the same spot, watching me. After what felt like an eternity, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things, shoving my laptop into my bag, my hands shaking. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I just needed to leave. I walked towards the back exit, away from the glass doors, hoping the figure wouldn't see me. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, mixing with the sound of the rain. I reached the door and pushed it open slowly, peeking outside. The rain was pouring down, the alley behind the building dark and deserted. I stepped outside, pulling my coat tight around me, and started walking towards the parking garage. My car was only a few blocks away, but every step felt like it took forever. The rain soaked through my clothes, making me shiver. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. When I finally reached the garage, I let out a sigh of relief. The lights inside were dim, flickering slightly, but it felt safer than being out in the open. I hurried to my car, fumbling with my keys. As I unlocked the door, I heard something, a soft rustling sound, like someone moving quickly behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the sound of the rain and the hum of the city. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was nothing. But as I got into my car and started the engine, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A shadow moving quickly past the entrance of the garage. It was the same figure, the same hood, the same piercing eyes. They hadn't just been watching me from the office. They had followed me here. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires screeching on the wet pavement as I backed out of the parking spot. The figure didn't run, didn't chase me. They just stood there, watching, as I sped out of the garage and into the rain-soaked streets. I drove as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who they were, what they wanted. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done with me. That this wasn't over. Even now, as I sit here in my apartment, typing this out, I can't get the image of those eyes out of my head. It was late, and the rain had picked up, tapping hard on the roof of the parking garage. I had just finished up dinner with some friends, and everyone else had left. I stayed a little longer, waiting for the rain to ease up, but it never did. The streets were slick and shiny under the dim lights, and the few cars left in the garage were covered in rain. The air smelled like wet concrete and oil, mixing with the faint echo of raindrops hitting the ground. I walked towards my car, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The garage was quiet except for the rain and the soft hum of the lights overhead. The sound of my shoes hitting the ground felt too loud. I felt alone, but not in a good way. The kind of alone where everything seems too big, too empty. My car was parked in the back corner, under one of the few working lights. When I reached my car, I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door. My hands were wet and a little shaky, but I managed to get the door open. I slid inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The rain drummed on the roof, a steady, constant noise that made everything else seem quieter. I just wanted to get home, out of the rain and the cold. I put the key in the ignition, but before I could start the car, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a trick of the light. But then I looked again, and I saw him. A man, standing at the far end of the garage, near the exit ramp. He was facing me, his body half in the light, half in the shadow. He was too far away to see clearly, but I could tell he was staring right at me. I froze, my hand still on the key. Something about the way he was standing, so still, made my stomach twist. I tried to convince myself he was just another person getting to their car, just like me. But then he started walking towards me. Slowly, deliberately. His footsteps were almost silent on the wet concrete, but I could hear them in my head, each step louder than the last. I felt my heart start to race. I wanted to start the car, but I didn't want to take my eyes off him. He kept coming, not rushing, just walking at that same slow, steady pace. My fingers fumbled with the keys, and I finally managed to turn the ignition. The engine roared to life, the sound breaking the silence in the garage, but he didn't stop. He just kept coming closer. I put the car in reverse, my hands shaking on the wheel. The rain was pounding harder now, the noise drowning out everything else. My headlights cut through the darkness, and I saw him more clearly. He was wearing a dark hoodie, pulled up over his head, and his face was shadowed. But I could see his eyes. They were locked on me, cold and expressionless. I backed out of the parking spot, my tires screeching on the wet concrete. He was getting closer, only a few car lengths away now. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely think straight. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there. As I backed out, he suddenly changed direction, walking towards the passenger side of my car. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't walking anymore. He was running. I slammed on the gas, the car lurching forward as I sped towards the exit. My tires slipped on the wet surface, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I saw him stop. He stood there, in the middle of the garage, just watching as I drove away. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. The rain was pouring down harder now, and I could barely see through the windshield, but I didn't slow down until I was out of the garage and back on the main road. My heart was still pounding as I drove, the rain blurring everything outside. I kept looking in the mirrors, expecting to see him behind me, but the road was empty. I didn't stop driving until I reached home, the garage door closing behind me with a heavy thud. It was supposed to be a quick drive back to the cabin I rented for the weekend. The rain started falling lightly at first, just a drizzle, but then it picked up. The wipers struggled against it, and I could barely see the road ahead. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere because nothing looked familiar anymore. The GPS signal was lost miles ago, leaving me with no directions. I was in the middle of nowhere, just trees on both sides and no signs of life. I was getting nervous, so I decided to turn around. I slowed down, looking for a place to make a U-turn, but the road was too narrow, surrounded by dense woods. Eventually, I saw a dirt road up ahead. It looked like a place where I could turn around and get back on track, so I took it. The dirt road was even worse. It was muddy from the rain, and my tires slipped a little as I drove. The trees seemed to close in on me, and the darkness outside the car felt heavy, almost suffocating. I could feel the tension in my chest as I realized how isolated I was. No lights, no houses, just endless woods. I tried to keep calm. I just needed to find a spot wide enough to turn around. The rain was pouring harder, and the dirt road seemed to go on forever. My headlights barely cut through the downpour, casting long, eerie shadows in the trees. After what felt like an eternity, I found a small clearing. It wasn't much, but it was wide enough to turn around. I slowed down, turning the wheel, trying to maneuver the car without getting stuck in the mud. That's when I saw the headlights. At first, they were faint, just a dim glow in the rearview mirror. But they grew brighter, closer, until they were right behind me. A car appeared, blocking the road I had just driven down. My heart started racing. The car's headlights were blinding in my mirror, making it impossible to see who was inside. I couldn't understand where it had come from. I had been alone on that road, and now, suddenly, this car was here, just sitting there, blocking my way out. I put the car in reverse, thinking maybe I could back out, but the other car didn't move. It just sat there, headlights glaring, engine idling. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. The rain was pounding on the roof, the noise almost deafening inside the car. I didn't know what to do. I honked my horn, hoping they would move, but the car stayed put. No one got out, no one signaled. It just sat there, blocking me in. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a coincidence, maybe they were lost too. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I thought about getting out of the car, going to talk to them, but the idea terrified me. I couldn't see who was inside. The windows were dark, and the rain made everything look blurry and distorted. I was trapped. My only way out was blocked, and there was no cell signal to call for help. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The car behind me still hadn't moved. I tried inching forward, thinking maybe I could find another way out, but the mud was thick, and my tires started spinning. Panic set in. I was stuck. Just then, the car behind me revved its engine. My heart jumped into my throat. The headlights seemed to grow brighter, and the engine roared as the car started moving slowly towards me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind racing with fear. I watched in the rearview mirror as the car crept closer, its tires crunching on the gravel and mud. It was only a few feet away now. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel the sweat on my palms despite the cold. And then, it stopped again. Right behind me, so close I could see the outline of the hood in my mirror. I felt trapped like an animal cornered with nowhere to go. I couldn't stay in the car any longer. I had to do something. I grabbed my phone, even though I knew there was no signal, and clutched it tightly. My only choice was to get out and confront whoever was in that car. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the door handle. But before I could open it, the car's headlights suddenly went out. The darkness swallowed the road, and I was left sitting in the pitch black, the rain hammering down on the roof. I couldn't see anything behind me anymore. It was as if the car had vanished, but I knew it was still there. I could feel it. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now. I couldn't bring myself to open the door, couldn't bring myself to face whatever was out there in the dark. I was frozen, trapped by fear, not knowing what to do next. Then, there was a knock. Not on my window, but on the back of my car. A single, loud knock that cut through the noise of the rain. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare turn around. My mind raced with all the terrible possibilities, and I felt like I was suffocating in the tight space of the car. Another knock, this time on the side window. I could see a faint outline of a figure through the rain-streaked glass. They were standing right next to my car. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their presence, cold and menacing, just inches away from me. I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts kicked in, and I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The tires spun in the mud, but after a few agonizing seconds, the car lurched forward. I didn't care about the road anymore. I just needed to get away. The car skidded and bounced as I sped down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides, mud splashing up onto the windshield. I didn't look back. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. Eventually, the road evened out, and I found myself back on the main road. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the lights of a small town appeared in the distance. I kept driving until I reached a gas station, where I finally stopped, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I never saw the car again. I was on the subway late, heading back home after a long shift. It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't let up, pouring down in sheets and making the whole city feel like it was drowning. The streets were mostly empty, and so was the subway station. The usual rush of people was gone, just the hum of the train in the distance and the dripping of water echoing through the tunnels. It was eerie, but I didn't think much of it. I just wanted to get home. When the train finally arrived, I got on and noticed I was the only one in the car. That wasn't too unusual for this time of night, especially with the weather, so I sat down near the door. The train doors closed with that familiar hiss, and the car jolted forward, moving into the dark tunnel. I leaned back, staring out at nothing, letting my mind wander. But then, I noticed something. I wasn't alone. Across from me, in the next row of seats, there was a person sitting there, staring right at me. I hadn't noticed them when I got on. It was like they just appeared out of nowhere. They were sitting perfectly still, eyes locked on me, not blinking, not moving at all. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just another late-night commuter. But something was off. Their clothes were soaked, dripping water onto the floor, but they didn't seem to care. Their face was pale, and those eyes didn't blink, not once. I looked away, trying to focus on something else, anything else, but I could feel their stare burning into me. The sound of the train on the tracks seemed louder, the lights in the car flickering slightly. I glanced back, hoping they'd stop staring, but they hadn't. They were still there, still staring, still unblinking. I started to get uncomfortable, shifting in my seat. The rain pounded against the windows, and the tunnel outside seemed to stretch on forever. I thought about changing cars, just getting up and moving, but something in me couldn't do it. It felt like if I moved, something bad would happen. So I stayed put, trying to ignore the person sitting across from me. But it was impossible. They didn't move, didn't flinch. Just sat there, staring. I couldn't even tell if they were breathing. The train lurched, and I gripped the edge of my seat. My heart was starting to race, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead despite the cold air in the car. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I forced myself to look directly at them, hoping maybe they'd look away, break the tension, but they didn't. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, almost too wide. Their mouth was slightly open, like they were about to say something, but no sound came out. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, but they didn't respond. Just kept staring. The silence in the car was suffocating. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, and the sound of the rain outside felt distant, like it wasn't even real. The train slowed down as we approached the next station. I thought about getting off, but it wasn't my stop, and I didn't want to be stranded in some random part of the city at this hour. The doors opened with a whoosh, and for a moment, I hoped someone else would get on, but no one did. The station was empty, just a faint echo of the rain outside. The doors closed, and the train started moving again. I was trapped in the car with them, and the feeling of dread was growing. I tried not to look, but my eyes kept drifting back to that pale face, those wide eyes. They hadn't moved at all. Not an inch. It was like they were a statue, but I knew they weren't. I could feel their presence, cold and unnerving. Another station passed, and still, no one got on. The train felt like it was getting colder, and my hands were starting to shake. I couldn't stay in that car any longer. I had to move, had to get away from that stare. I stood up slowly, trying not to look at them, and started walking toward the next car. As I passed them, I felt their eyes follow me, even though their head didn't move. It was like they were watching me without turning their head, and it made my skin crawl. I hurried to the door at the end of the car, but when I reached it, the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. I tugged on it, harder, but it wouldn't open. Panic started to rise in my chest. I turned around, and they were still sitting there, still staring. But now, there was something different. Their mouth was open wider, like they were grinning, but it wasn't a normal grin. It was twisted, unnatural, like they were enjoying my fear. I backed away, feeling trapped. The train rattled through the tunnel, the lights flickering again. I pressed myself against the door, praying for the next station to come. My eyes were locked on them now, unable to look away, and that grin seemed to grow wider, more distorted. Finally, the train started to slow down again. The next station was coming up, and I felt a surge of relief. The doors would open, and I could get out of this nightmare. I didn't care where I ended up. I just needed to get off this train. The train came to a stop, and the doors opened. I didn't wait. I bolted out of the car, not looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. The station was empty, deserted, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I ran up the stairs, out into the rain, letting the cold water wash over me. It felt real, grounding, like I had escaped something terrible. I didn't stop running until I was out on the street, away from the subway, away from that stare. I don't know what that person was, or if they were even real, but I still see their face sometimes. In my dreams, in dark corners, in the reflections of windows. That twisted grin, those unblinking eyes. They're always watching, and I can't shake the feeling that one day, I'll see them again. It was one of those nights when the rain just wouldn't stop. The kind that makes everything feel colder, heavier. I was home alone, which I didn't mind usually. The house was quiet, just the sound of raindrops hitting the roof, running down the windows. I had the TV on, low volume, more for company than anything else. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Virginia, where nothing much happens. It's the kind of place where you know your neighbors but aren't really close to them. The houses are spaced far enough apart that you can have your own space, but close enough that you can see each other's lights at night. It was around 10:30, maybe a little later, when I first heard it. A faint noise, like something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. We get raccoons and deer sometimes, especially when it rains. But something about it made me pause. It wasn't just the wind, and it wasn't just an animal. I muted the TV, straining to listen. The rain was still coming down hard, making it tough to hear anything else, but there it was again. A shuffling sound, like footsteps, but slow. Too slow to be someone just passing by. It seemed to be coming from the backyard. I got up from the couch and went to the kitchen window, the one that looks out over the backyard. The glass was fogged up from the warmth inside, so I wiped it with my sleeve. For a moment, all I could see was darkness and the blurry shapes of trees swaying in the wind. But then I noticed it. Someone was standing at the very edge of my yard, just beyond the tree line. At first, I couldn't make out much, just a dark figure, motionless, facing the house. My heart started pounding. It wasn't a neighbor, not at this hour, and they were just standing there, not moving, not doing anything. I tried to tell myself it was just someone passing through, maybe someone lost. But the longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. They weren't moving. They were just watching. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling, and I debated calling the police. But what would I say? Someone was standing in my yard. They weren't doing anything, just standing there. I wasn't even sure if that was something the police would take seriously. I turned off the kitchen light, hoping that would make it harder for them to see me. I peeked out again, trying to get a better look, but the rain made it hard to see any details. I couldn't tell if they were a man or a woman, young or old. Just a dark shape against the wet grass and trees. I stood there for what felt like forever, just watching, waiting for them to do something, anything. But they didn't. They just kept standing there, staring at the house. My house. I could feel their eyes, even though I couldn't see their face. It was a feeling that sank into my bones, made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to turn on the back porch light, hoping it would scare them off. Maybe they didn't realize someone was home. Maybe they thought the house was empty, and seeing the light would make them leave. I flipped the switch, and the backyard flooded with light. The figure didn't move. Not even a flinch. Now, I could see them a little clearer, but it didn't make me feel any better. They were tall, wearing dark clothes that clung to their body in the rain. Their head was tilted slightly, like they were trying to get a better look at me. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. They were holding something in their hand, something long and thin. I couldn't make out what it was, but the way they gripped it sent a wave of panic through me. I backed away from the window, not wanting to be seen anymore. My mind was racing. Should I call the police now? Should I turn off all the lights and hope they leave? Every scenario that ran through my head made me feel more helpless. I moved to the living room, trying to keep my breathing steady, but it was hard. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see that figure right outside, peering in. The rain was pounding against the glass, louder now, more insistent. Then, I heard it again. That shuffling sound, but this time it was closer. Much closer. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound was coming from the side of the house, near the windows by the living room. I felt sick, the kind of fear that makes your legs feel weak. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the biggest one I had, and held it tight. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but having it in my hand made me feel a tiny bit better. I listened, waiting for the sound again, but it stopped. Everything was quiet, except for the rain. Too quiet. I crept over to the front door, making sure it was locked. I double-checked the windows, making sure they were secure. I wanted to feel safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept pacing the living room, trying to figure out what to do. My phone was in my pocket, but I couldn't bring myself to call anyone yet. I didn't want to sound crazy. But then I heard it, a faint tapping on the window, just behind me. I spun around, and there they were. Right outside the living room window, closer now. Their face was pressed against the glass, pale and distorted by the rain. I couldn't see their eyes, but I knew they were looking right at me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the knife. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto it. The tapping continued, soft but deliberate, like they were trying to get my attention. I finally grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice was shaky as I told the operator what was happening. They assured me help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes on the figure outside, waiting for them to do something, waiting for them to try to get in. But they didn't. They just stood there, tapping on the glass, like they were playing some sick game. The rain kept falling, washing down the window, blurring their face even more. I don't know how long it took for the police to arrive, but it felt like forever. When I heard the sirens, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The figure outside must have heard them too because they finally moved. They turned away from the window, walking slowly back towards the trees at the edge of the yard. By the time the police knocked on my door, the figure was gone. They searched the yard, the woods, but they didn't find anyone. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I saw. The police told me to stay inside, to lock all the doors and windows, and to call them if anything else happened. I nodded, but I could still feel that presence, that cold stare, even after they left. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes tired, and my back sore. It was past midnight, and I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, heading toward a town that still felt hours away. I needed to stretch my legs, maybe grab a drink, so when I saw the sign for a rest area, I pulled in. The place looked empty. Not surprising, given the time and the weather. The parking lot was wet and shining under the dim lights, reflecting the dark sky above. I parked close to the building, as close as I could, because the rain was coming down in sheets. The only other vehicle there was a van, parked a little further away, near the edge of the lot. Its lights were off, and it was just sitting there, silent. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stepped out of my car, the cold rain hitting me immediately. I hunched my shoulders against it and made a run for the restroom, the wind pushing the rain sideways into my face. The building wasn't much, just a concrete box with a few vending machines outside and the restroom inside. I pushed open the door, the smell of wet concrete and disinfectant hitting me as I stepped in. The restroom was empty, too. It was one of those old ones, with cracked tiles and flickering lights. I did my business, washed my hands, and splashed some water on my face to wake myself up. I glanced at myself in the mirror, my eyes red and tired, and thought about how much longer I had to drive. I just wanted to be home. When I stepped back outside, the rain hadn't let up. It was still pouring, and I could hear the wind howling through the trees that lined the rest area. I jogged back toward my car, my shoes slipping on the wet pavement. That's when I noticed it. The van was gone. I stopped for a second, looking around the parking lot, but there was no sign of it. Just empty spaces and puddles reflecting the yellow lights. It struck me as odd, but I figured they must have left while I was in the restroom. Maybe I just hadn't heard them over the sound of the rain. I reached my car, fishing in my pocket for the keys. As I got closer, I noticed something that made me freeze. Someone was standing by the back of my car, in the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. A dark figure, barely visible in the rain. My heart started pounding. I stopped, just a few steps from my car, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They were just standing there, not moving, not saying anything. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body in the darkness. The rain was so loud I could barely hear myself think, but I could feel my pulse quickening. I took a step back, trying to decide what to do. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this person from the van? Had they been watching me the whole time? I glanced around the parking lot again, but there was no one else. Just me and this person, in the middle of nowhere, with the rain pouring down. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't respond. They didn't move, just kept standing there, like they were waiting for something. My skin prickled with unease. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the car without turning my back to them. My hands were shaking, the rain making everything slippery. I couldn't tell if they were getting closer or if it was just my imagination, but I felt trapped. The idea of turning my back to them made my stomach twist with fear. Finally, I got the door unlocked. I yanked it open and jumped inside, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The rain drummed on the roof of the car, but inside it was silent. Too silent. I forced myself to look up, to see if the figure was still there. My headlights cut through the rain, casting long shadows across the lot. But when I looked at the back of the car, they were gone. Just like that. The space where they had been standing was empty, as if they had never been there at all. I scanned the parking lot again, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no sign of them. My heart was still racing, and my skin felt clammy. I didn't want to get out of the car again, not for anything. But I couldn't just sit there, waiting for them to come back. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and I backed out of the parking spot as quickly as I could. My tires skidded on the wet pavement, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as much distance between me and that rest area as possible. As I pulled onto the highway, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that van following me. But there was nothing. Just a dark, rain-soaked road stretching out behind me. I drove for miles, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes flicking from the road to the mirrors and back again. The rain eventually started to let up, but the tension in my chest didn't. Every shadow on the side of the road made me jump, every car that passed made my heart skip a beat. I didn't stop again until I reached a town hours later. By then, the rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. I pulled into a gas station, my body exhausted, my mind still reeling from what had happened. I never saw that person again. I don't know who they were, what they wanted, or why they were waiting by my car that night. But every time I drive past a rest area now, especially on a rainy night, I can't help but think about it. About how close they were, about how easy it would have been for them to do something. I guess I'll never know what could have happened if I hadn't gotten into my car when I did. And maybe it's better that way.